Welcome to Pixel Pizza,
Did she say pizza?
your ultimate source for chiptunes, video game talk, and pepperoni. Delivered to you from Los Angeles and into the digital cyberspace of the 2020s.
Pizza power!
That's right, one super giant pizza.
I want a large, thick crust with double cheese, ham, pepperoni. Hey, where's my pizza? Pizza time.
Welcome back to the Pixel Pizza podcast, listeners. You just heard from our chiptune artist of the week, 380 Bitworks, and that track was called Startup. So, hope you like that one. And now we are here with our interview portion of the show. We are speaking this week with the creative director at Sunset Visitor. Their game, 1000xResist, has been nominated for an IGF award and at the Golden Joysticks. It is a narrative adventure game, and the creative director is Remy Siu. How are you doing, Remy?
Good, I'm doing good. Thank you for having me on.
Of course. So, I like to get started by asking, when in your life, Remy, did you know you wanted to work in games?
I think actually really early on. I think I was really fascinated by games as a kid, and then I got a PlayStation. I think I was at that age where I think my parents were like, "Oh, you need something to do that's not bothering us." And my cousins had like a Super Nintendo or a original NES. But the first console I had was a PlayStation. I didn't really know what it was. I was like, is this a Nintendo? Like, is this like I of course was not following the gaming press as a kid. So I was really confused by what it was when I got it. But it seemed like such a magical object to me because it looked nothing like the Nintendos. Or like the Super Nintendo or whatever the consoles that Nintendo was releasing at the time. And I think that had a weird big effect on me where I was like, oh, this object that does such wild things, and like seeing 3D games, and kind of from a couple of games into it, I think I was like, I would really love to make one of these. Or I would really like, they seem so magical to me. So I think that was pretty early on. I think something like Final Fantasy VII, which I also got at a very young age, so much so that I didn't really understand it. I think that was also something that, drove me towards actually the arts. And it was my inability to make any games as a kid in the 90s, because that was not something you could do then. That kind of drove me towards the arts, and drove me towards fiction or music and various things like this, where I was like, I guess if I can't make games right now, what are some things that I can kind of make that are like games, I guess, other art. So that's kind of how I got in. Yeah, I had always had the desire, but it was a kind of long round trip to making games, actually. So
Yeah, and I'd love to get into that. I mean, I can definitely say for me, I think the PlayStation 1 is a very special system, and even just like the boot up screen and the menus and everything, it definitely took you to a different world. I think it had such a
yeah,
specific style that was like
yes,
unlike anything at the time.
it felt super fresh.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, like everything when you're a kid is fresh, right?
Of
Like,
course.
yeah, but like in a very particular way, I guess it was like communicating various types of aesthetic. And then later on in retrospect, as an adult, you go back and you realize that there was like so much kind of about kind of like, Japanese um, underground electronic music or like kind of
Oh yeah.
synths and all of this stuff that was involved in like even making that sound or like making the kind of general vibe or feeling of what PlayStation 1 was, um, especially in the games. And you don't realize that as a kid. You only like, many decades later are you thinking like, so that's what, putting a name to some of these feelings
Mm-hmm.
that you had.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, before you sort of made the leap into game development, when you were sort of harnessing those creative desires that you had, uh, you got involved in a number of sort of multimedia projects and a bunch of live shows. So I'd love to hear more about those.
Yeah, I went to study at this school called, well, it's a local one in Vancouver called Simon Fraser University. And there they have an arts program that is really great. I mean, it's a contemporary arts program, and it encompasses all the various disciplines: music, dance, theater, film, visual arts. No games though, by the way.
Mm.
But and it and of like as an art school, it was like relatively new, right? I think it was like kind of came into fruition. I think in the 60s and the 70s, like it had the school itself has like a huge hippie culture, kind of radical political culture, being a very young school, young university itself. And I don't know if you've ever been to Vancouver, but like the actual campus of Simon Fraser, at least the original one, is like a huge brutalist structure on a mountain,
Oh, really?
on Burnaby Mountain, and is kind of like often used in Vancouver as science fiction
Hmm.
sets, right? And so, like for sure, if you've watched Battlestar Galactica, you've seen that school,
Oh, okay.
and it's like all cement. But like going to that is just to say that the art school was did not have a lot of like more traditional conservatory type baggage, and so it was very interested in at least in the music program taking anybody off the street and becoming a composer. um, Say you didn't even need to read music, right? Like that was the idea. It was like very anti-conservatory, anti-tradition this way. Um, and so I went there to study music because it was largely the only school I could probably study music at. I wasn't like a gifted musician or anything like that. Um, and I learned a lot about composition. And through that, I also went to collaborate with a lot of like dancers and theater makers and filmmakers and visual artists, because we were all kind of packed into the same space. Um, and so after graduating, I spent a lot of time making experimental stage works. Um, and I did do composition as well, but then they started to slowly merge over time. Like if I were to consider composition being like writing notes on paper and giving it to musicians, and the more kind of stage work side, a kind of more embodied theater type, dance type practice. Like slowly over time, those things drifted together for me. Um, and my way into it was using kind of visual programming networks, visual programming environments like Isadora and VVV and Touch Designer, in a real time theater context, and kind of quote unquote live coding sometimes along with the performers to try and keep up with them. Um, so I did that, for like 10 years, I guess,
Hmm.
in like the 2010s. And we were lucky enough to like, make shows and tour them and learn, in multiple contexts as well, to like music festivals and theater festivals and all kinds of different festivals. We were like disciplinary nomads, in that
Wow.
way. Um, there's a blessing and curse to it, right? Like you can, if you make kind of experimental stage works, that can fit in multiple contexts, that expands a touring network for it. But at the same time, it can hamper, um, any particular kind of infrastructural benefits that you would get along a single discipline, I guess. So, but we liked it that way, I guess. I don't know. We liked we liked kind of jumping from different contexts. Um, so that was a lot of the work that I did before, and just prior to starting, this company and working on the game. A lot of the way that I was thinking about stage performance was building software and hardware systems for stage that were interested in using kind of algorithm and states and all of these things to act on the performers on stage, um, so that you would get a different performance every night as well. So
Wow. Yeah, I guess that would make sense that, different audiences, different places that you took the show would have different responses depending on sort of what discipline and what context it was in.
yeah, I think it was most warm in more theater and mixed contexts, some of the works that I was making at the time. And it was a little bit more chilly sometimes in the music context, which is funny because I
Mm.
often was coming from it from a very kind of harsh compositional background. Like we did a performance in Utrecht in a festival called Gaudiamos, which is like one of the oldest quote unquote new classical music, contemporary music festivals in the world. And there was some pushback and controversy around my use of technology inside of these
Really?
things against a more traditional uh, context, I guess. It's yeah.
Yeah, I love the possibilities of new technologies with live performances. I had a friend in graduate school who did a project where it was a production of Peter Pan, but Tinkerbell was like a hologram.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So like using some kind of either projection mapping or kind of, it is just an extension of stagecraft, in so many ways.
Yeah.
It's like kind of what tools do we have at this given time. And but based on some of the materiality of all this stuff, if you're like thinking really hard as an artist, you would say like, okay, how does that new materiality come to affect
Hmm.
some of the formal aspects of how something is made, and then and thus how it can be organized, I guess. But that's very composer brain. I don't
Oh,
know.
yeah. Was there
Yeah,
any
yeah.
example of something you discovered, some new possibility that you were able to sort of think, oh, this is how I can use it in a narrative I want to produce?
Maybe not so much of a narrative aspect of it. I think it's funny because like a lot of my stage work is much less narrative driven
Mm.
than, say, for example, the game we just made. But uh, the one of the things, for example, is in a music work where we employed some sort of like real time gameplay like systems for the performers, um, and we were able to have as many modes and expressions of that one mechanic. Um, I think we had like 15 or 17 or whatever. I can't remember at this point, but we had a lot of them. But then, the composer brain kicks in and you're like, wait a minute. Okay. Like now let's kind of discover the intervallic relationships between these modes. Like what does it feel like to watch them, and how far apart is that feeling, I guess, like,
Mm.
what would be considered like a close jump from one mode to another, or like a small intervallic value, and can that be perceivable, and then can you organize that in such a way that you have a scale. Again, this is very music brain. And then once
Mm.
you organize material that um, enough in that way, can you use that scale to make a line, right? Or um, and so many of this so much of this is like, thinking about how to deploy compositional thinking or music compositional thinking across outside of just um, a way to organize pitch or a way to organize rhythm or a way to organize harmony. Yeah, so I think that was kind of like a constant discovery.
Oh.
Yeah,
And then how were you able to bring that musical composition thinking into game development?
I think it was really helpful, um, for me at least, in kind of organizing the non-linearity of the game,
Mm.
of 1000 times resist, and kind of like um, thinking about that, throughout development, and and just kind of understanding what maybe should happen next or how things should unfold, and kind of having some um, tools, like brain tools, I guess, um, to sift through material and then organize it, I think was extremely helpful. And like as a kid, I did lots of writing and writing fiction, but in retrospect, and I've said this before, it felt very unmoored. But like, of course, you're also a kid, so like everything feels up in the air,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't really know how to do anything. But um, kind of coming back to it, like I think the ways of thinking about how to organize material, and ways you might organize that in a kind of short time duration, I guess, um, really helped ground the writing of the game for me. And because there's so many arcane things that happen when you write fiction that are like operating on the back end of the surface of it, which is like, I guess, um, the immediate objective narrative surface of it, right? But there's so many things happening underneath that are hard to always express, and being able to learn and think abstractly about material, because that's sometimes much of what music is,
Mm-hmm.
was really helpful in navigating um, a lot of narrative complexities with 1000 times resist. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess sort of on a similar note, uh, one of the things I read was that you challenged yourselves to create a narrative game without combat. And so I was wondering, what other forms of action and sort of urgency uh, you found could move the story forward without relying on fighting.
A lot of it was actually, this comes back down to that arcane aspect of it, where it's like a lot of it was like, obviously you want the, not, well, not obviously, but like you do want the player to want to find out what happens next, right?
Mm.
And how are all of the ways that can manifest. um i I think once we remove not just combat, but even streamline some things that were existing in other narrative games, like point and click adventure games, right?
Mm.
um so there was like no inventory as well. It left a lot of empty space um, in what you might consider a game in which we had to fill lots of things. Um, but then, I think that's kind of the fun part of subtracting things like that. You're forced with a situation where you have to fill that empty space with stuff. Um, and then, yeah, you ask yourself a question like, what stuff, and maybe I think when it came to the narrative for us, like we were always leaning back on like, well, you just have to always maintain a degree of tension with the audience on different levels on what they may want to find out, right? Whether it may be on a level of thematic suspension, where they're like, okay, I want on a very high level, broad level, I understand these higher level thematic things that are happening, but they're not resolved, right? Or they're far away from being resolved, or they're in the moment of being in tension. Like, how is that operating on that its own level, and then on a kind of pacing level, like, what immediately has happened before and what's happened afterwards, like is there kind of ebb and flow on the pacing level, and then on the very lowest level, it's like a moment to moment, like dialogue, line by line dialogue writing,
Mm.
where you're trying to understand all sorts of things, where maybe the audience is trying to guess what the character is actually trying to communicate to them. Maybe they're trying to find out a smaller bit of actual kind of grounded lore information, whether they're trying to unfold so some other thing. I guess this is, to try and answer your question, it was like really kind of clearly understanding all of the levels in which the audience may be experiencing some degree of cognitive tension or desire,
Mm-hmm.
um, directly kind of interfacing with the narrative.
Yeah, the
Uh,
intrigue is everything.
yeah, and then kind of like, whether again, putting on like the music brain, it's like, is if there is thematic tension at the broadest level, um, is there some resolution on the lower level between characters, um, so that there is not just a big unison, like, we would
Mm-hmm.
consider it unison, like a huge monophonic thing. It's more that there is like some degree of, I guess you would call it some degree of harmony. Not to say that harmony is about being harmonious. It can be about also being dissonant, right?
Yeah.
So so yeah, like I think that kind of thinking about it was what we tried to fill
Oh.
in the place of combat, right? Because in combat you do have that tension release, you do have this kind of more, um, your brain switches over into, and that, I guess that's what you would maybe call a traditional game loop, right?
Mhm.
Traditional mechanical game loop where there's like, um, some circular nature to it on a smaller level, um, and on a broad level. But because we did not have those mechanical things to fall back on, we had to do it at a narrative level.
Mhm. So, what would you say, like an average day looks like for you as a creative director?
Oh, like during development or like right now?
Both. Hit me with both.
Yeah, okay. During development, um, like we start pretty late compared to, um, well, everybody kind of sets their own time. But I generally get in around 10 or 11. Um, and then depending on how it goes, like there may be, I'm working an engine that day on a scene. And then there may be a meeting with the publisher, excuse me, to discuss, marketing. And then there may be a meeting with the composers to just to listen to what they've done, um, and either give feedback or be like, hey, this is awesome, let's like just print it, I guess, and throw it in the game. um, and there may be, discovery of some bugs, or trying to build something out. We discover a gap in a system, and then that's communicated to the programmer. And then in the highest peak of development, like there's all of that stuff. And then at night, there is the voiceover recordings. So we go to the voiceover recordings, which thankfully is in the office because we have a voiceover booth. We bought one specifically for the company to keep it in house.
That's great.
We would go and, we would go over there, and there would also be another writer or writers, in the voiceover session, and we would conduct a 2 to 4 hour voiceover recording session with whoever's coming in. So, but definitely at the peak of it, my brain was pretty scrambled, right? Like, so
Mm.
like I would get in and have to like refocus myself, into the voiceover sessions. Um, and what else would be during that day? Like, of course, there's always little emails throughout
Oh, of
the
course.
day. But actually, I would say that maybe during development there was less so this, thankfully, and of course, if we had writing to review, we would review that, and we would give feedback to the writers, and then go on. And then, like on always on the basic level, on the base level, I was like working in Unity trying to put together things, right? And we
Hmm.
did not have that many people working in Unity for the game. Like I think, majority of the time we had two people working in Unity, including myself, and then another person, um, who would jump in and out of Unity, on occasion.
Mm.
And so, um, not a lot of people. And so like that was during development. And then at different parts of development, I was had to switch gears entirely to go looking for money, right?
Oh, sure.
Um, yeah, and so that was always difficult. And so that was kind of like a back and forth cycle of what it was like day to day doing development. And then nowadays I do a lot of email right now, kind of planning future projects, and also doing a lot of talking to people like you, which has been really great just to um, meet people who talk about games and other things like this, um, and a lot of paperwork, kind of
Mhm.
resolving the 1000 times resist from a paperwork perspective. So, um, yeah.
Yeah, well, I saw you've been on a number of podcasts, and I was like, on one hand, I was like, I'm flattered to be among the ones that you've been on because they've been really high profile ones. But on the other hand, I've been like, how can I make this interesting for him and talk about stuff that hasn't talked about before?
Thank you. I mean, like it's I think every show is so different. I mean, like at this point, I think people are realizing probably that I've been on a lot of
Mhm.
podcasts, but I think part of it is that yeah, every audience is so different. I don't know, and every host
Mhm.
obviously is very different and has a different angle in on it, and um it's also an effort of that like I think prior to the launch of the game, we didn't actually do very much
Mm.
of this kind of thing. Um, and I think, upon reflection, for us, we would just like to be a little bit more out in the open and around than we
Sure.
previously were, where we were kind of just like heads down in development. And we may have to return to that state, but just trying to make the most of being out in the world again, I guess, and
Yeah.
not yeah, chained to my desk.
So you would say it was probably then more word of mouth that uh, got the game the success that it had?
I do think, yeah, I mean, I think it's um like we didn't have like the biggest launch day, right? And part of that was perhaps the fact that like May 9th, the day that we released, was really wild
Mm.
and there were tons of indies. So a lot of competition, I guess, but which turned out to be good on a press cycle level. But I think that the continued kind of sales that we're seeing, and the excitement of the game of the year lists
Mhm.
and the awards, um I think that is largely due to the fact that people who have played it and have become fans are really passionate about it, and they've been kind of getting other people to play it, so I think that's been something that we continually talk about in the studio. Is like, wow, we're so grateful for this is wild,
Yeah, it's
and
amazing.
not something that we anticipated.
Mm.
So yeah, I would say it's word of mouth for sure, 100%.
Getting back to you were talking about the voice acting process. I know speaking as a voice actor myself, as you were
Hmm.
saying, it's very rare that the actors get to sort of interface directly with the developers
Right.
and record in front of them. And so, what do you think that added to it?
I think it made a huge difference. I think, one of the things early on is that we cast before we wrote, which seems like a wild idea. Like,
Mhm.
we didn't even have a full understanding of the characters before we cast. Um, and so we were just largely looking for interesting presence that we felt fit the kind of general direction that we thought we were going with each character. Um, and then we recorded chapter by chapter, or like chunk by chunk throughout the whole development. So we were recording, not every day, but like quite consistently for a period of like maybe 2 years, or at least a year, and then off a couple of months, then a bunch of intense recording at the near the end.
Wow.
But I think what was really great about that from a writing perspective is that, and this is something that we're going to try and carry forward, is that I do want it to be that the writer can write a line and kind of shepherd that line all the way into the game, um, so that they're kind of giving direction to the voice actors. They're giving input in those sessions, they're learning from the actors as well. I think that's really important. I think writers become better writers as they listen to actors perform their words, like that's for sure a feedback loop that I think is really important. Um, and so that there is not as much of a disconnect that can possibly arise if the people who did not write those words were not in the room.
Mm.
So like there's a general sense of a writer can give a direction from the sense that, look, I wrote these words, but I think what we mean is this, right? Because there's a general sense that characters or people don't always say what they mean,
Mm.
and so that can be kind of carried through to the session. And then sometimes voice actors would come in, like the first thing we would always do is like we wouldn't give them any direction, right? We would just be like, let's just read the scene. And then they would come in with whatever they had worked on prior, right? Or sometimes it may be that they're coming in just fresh, especially when it came to more untrained. Specifically, that we also worked with untrained performers on purpose, and so they're just reading it truly fresh, like.
Mm.
And so like there would be discoveries in that moment for us with the actors. We would be like, oh, we would not take it we didn't think we would take it that way, right? But this is a great direction. Maybe let's lean in on this direction. So things like that would appear, and we would kind of riff with the performer in the booth on those kinds of things. And then as we kind of got used to that over time, I think it just made us better writers. Like we learned a lot. We learned what we didn't have to write, because we kind of were confident that our cast would fill the gap in there, or like we would, yeah, you just get a better instinct and sense for that when you start to trust your cast to do something, and vice versa. So I think that's really important. And I think that's something we're just going to continue to do because it's a value also of ours in process, in terms of our kind of devised theater background, that we want to involve those people who are coming in and doing voice acting. We want to involve their opinion and input as well, because it just becomes a richer experience this way. And everybody is coming in is different, and they're going to bring their own everything into it, right? And their whole self in a way that it's like hard to understand. And from the very beginning, what we wanted to avoid was like, yeah, I need a voice that sounds like this, or a voice that sounds like this, or this needs to be this archetypal type of thing. And that was the effort in casting early on. We're like, no, we're not. we're casting people based on their like presence, and trying not to prescribe an archetype onto them, and not have any expectation on how they may come and deliver a line. So yeah, a lot of kind of process values driven into our voiceover stuff.
That's amazing. Yeah, I know some words of wisdom I got from one of my coaches, Craig Lee Thomas, who was recently the face of Helldivers 2.
Oh, nice.
He said, when you're making a choice in acting, it doesn't have to be the right choice, but it has to be justified and it has to be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I can definitely see that a lot in what you were talking about with the process and everyone having something to offer.
Yeah, people would make such interesting choices, like if you give them the opportunity, and that's one of those things where, we're quite, what's the word? We're quite careful. I think like we don't like giving line readings, like never, like we still are kind of don't like crossing that boundary.
Sure.
And also we don't like kind of, at least in the sessions, like we wouldn't come in. It's like, all right, let me explain all of this to you. It would just start with like, let's just try the scene and see what happens, before kind of honing on specifics. Because if you do that too early, you really cut off the potentiality of the choices that could be made. If a person feels like they're narrowed into that choice, it can sometimes, I'm sure, be overwhelming for the performer though, because they have such a wide canvas in that regard. But I think, the outcome of it, or like I think there's benefits. The benefits outweigh the negatives in that regard. Um, Kind of having the performers feel like they could offer anything, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's definitely a balance. Sometimes it is just tell me what to do.
yeah, no,
But sometimes,
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
uh, and so also there was the whole motion capture process for the game. Was it also the actors doing that, or was that a separate thing?
That was a separate thing with our these two dancers, three dancers that worked on the game. Um, we didn't have a situation where we could like record voice and movement at the same time, right?
Yeah, it's
So
like a AAA thing.
yeah, that's like a triple A thing. And so often what they were doing was kind of actually somewhat similar. It's like we would get together, um, they would put the suit on, and I've worked with these like dancers for a really long time as well. And it would just be like, all right, let's just riff on like poses and gestures um around a high school, for example. Like let's just record a bunch of that. And then they would offer um these gestures and or things, and then we would just continue riffing until we captured as much as we could,
Hmm.
time permitting, and then move on to another situation where it would be around a theme or place of gesture. Um, and then we kind of accumulated a large bank of what's the word of motion capture data, or these different poses or animations, in which we spent some time categorizing them and then using them throughout the game. Um, but a lot of it, like, I mean, it's interesting because it's funny because like I guess they're all clones, and this is a nice way that I can see like a lot of it between the three of them. They have a very particular way of moving or being that if you knew them, you would be like, oh yeah, I see. They're all kind of around this group of three dancers who move in this very specific, who are, I guess, attracted to move in this very specific way based on their interests. Um, yeah, and then of course we also used it to help with some of the cutscene animations. Yeah, which was a slightly different process. It was more, can you help us capture data that would lessen the workload on certain things.
So that was more like storyboarded for the cutscenes.
Yeah, that kind of thing was more storyboarded, or there was a more specific uh, unidirectional flow
Hmm.
of that, with the animators and the motion performers. Whereas, say, for example, some of the poses we captured was a little bit more circular, um, in the sense that we were asking them to, much like in device theater, kind of generate material in the room.
And I know one of the things that was a bigger challenge in the development process was bringing the game to Switch.
Oh
So,
yeah.
yeah, how did you pull that off?
um, it was really hard, and a lot of the effort, uh, a lot of credit has to be given to our programmer, Colin, who essentially kind of became a graphics programmer a little bit as well in this whole process. And I think it's a year period of time for Colin, and then eventually I jumped onto this as well, um, to do the work to get the game working on the Switch. And I think this was we had never attempted to do anything like this before, and there was a lot of like technical challenges that we did not understand, until we started really getting into it. So we were learning on the go, and some people I've talked to, like, like, could it not have been done by an external um, firm or something? But I think in the end, a lot of the choices that we made were ones that we were only comfortable making. Like we changed the whole way the characters would be lit, for example. Like
Mm.
it's kind of like we did one more pass on the art style to both optimize it, but then make it more interesting, I guess, simultaneously. Um, and but we spent a lot of time and work trying to understand which angles we had to dig into to make sure that it could run well. And we were kind of facing, like, every game faces its own. What I should say is, like, I think every game is different, in the sense that it's hard to fall back on common sense, or that's something we learned. Like, it's hard to fall back on common sense onto how you may optimize this thing to make it work well on the platform. And we ran into that over and over again because of a specific set of circumstances based on the specific game that we were making. For example, you know, the real-time lights are expensive, right? And casting shadow with real-time lights are expensive, at least in this context. With the current technologies that we were using, and the platform that we were targeting. And however, we could not, usually the solution to this is to bake those lights. But we couldn't because, sorry, excuse me. In the time switching system that we have, we need to be able to switch between all of these lights, all of these states quite quickly on kind of user command. And so we could not bake those lights. And if we did bake those lights, it would take up a lot of memory, and then we would run into a different concern, like a memory concern, which we were already running up to with the Switch, because I think it's like very public knowledge that the Switch does not have a lot of memory.
Yeah.
Right. At least relative to more modern consoles or systems. So there was a lot of these types of intersections that we had to kind of solve, sometimes in a handsy way. And it did involve, say, like me relighting the game, I think in the last 3 months of development.
Wow.
and finding a replacement for the volumetric light system specifically for the Switch, and then replacing all of those lights. Finding new ways to kind of slice and dice the models that we had, both character and environment models, to allow them to be rendered in a more efficient fashion for the Switch was also a huge challenge. And finding the right kind of approach to that as well, because like too many tiny pieces, say, is like too much, like it will just kind of jam up the whole system. But too many big pieces will also take a long time to render and jam up the system. So we were just kind of finding this, like doing all these tests to find just like the right amount of, like, the size of quote unquote piece, and how many of that can pass through. Yeah, all of that stuff. So yeah, it was a huge challenge. It was a huge challenge.
I'm sure, yeah. I mean, obviously, it's so great that there are so many more tools and videos and sort of
Yeah.
information out there for people who are making games and facing these problems. But every game is going to be different, and certainly you guys, your game is very innovative and very sort of its own thing. And I imagine for that, there's not really like a catch-all solution.
Yeah. A lot of assumptions that we made that we thought was common sense kind of flew right back in our face. So, but I'm really happy that we did it. I mean, also because we learned a lot, and that's its own reward to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think, I mean, from the whole process, is the biggest thing that you learned that you want to take into future projects?
Oh, that's a really good question. I have to think. Maybe it's not so much like what I learned as much as like, and this is something I always think about, like each artwork that you work on, if the practice is self-generative, I guess, every project will solve a set of problems and generate a set of new questions, right? And if you're lucky, those questions are interesting.
Mm.
And so you can continue to live and try and answer those questions, I guess. I shouldn't say, it shouldn't be so dramatic, but like, to continue to be a curious person in the world, um, trying to actively think through new problems. And I think, a lot of what going into the game was, especially coming from the arts, was, hey, we want to create an organization, a company, I guess, in this case, that can pay us a full-time salary.
Yeah.
We want to create a place where we can accrue institutional memory. So as we don't feel like we're starting from scratch every single time, because that's much of the feeling of what we had in the arts. We were always, from a resource level and from a artistic level, it's not so much of a problem from artistic level, it's more exciting that side, but like from a logistics level, feeling like we're starting from scratch every single time is painful. And feeling that we could not accrue a sense of momentum and expertise that way. And additionally, I think we wanted to set up a lot of processes that can extend out into the future, right? And so, the voiceover, for example, was like a project beyond just this game. We wanted to set out a process that was, you could do voiceover at this scale, at this scope. And kind of coming out of the project, I think the questions that I have in mind are things like, well, I mean, more boring questions like, okay, now we did it with the voiceover thing. Like, how can we improve it on a very technical level? Like, how can we continue to make that easier for everybody involved, and then also better from a technical perspective to achieve a higher quality of it. But also now from like accruing institutional memory, like the first time where we are holding institutional memory, I guess, in our hands. Like, how do we kind of deploy that effectively on our next projects, and also how can we continue to resolve some of the tensions, say, between a more performing arts driven kind of high energy fast frequency cycle, and more of, say, like an office setting, right? Which is not 100% what all performing artists are used to. And this comes from both levels, right? Like, you're asking performing artists to come in and do work by sitting down and kind of thinking and working on it, right? And they're not used to that. They're used to, like, moving, and they're used to standing up. They're used to like jumping around. They're used to moving across town.
Sure.
And vice versa, is that like people coming from a more office setting, it's like they're not as used to, say, some of the faster frequencies that we are used to in the performing arts. And so there's like this continuing tension, which I think is both from a formal arts and logistics level, that is really interesting, that I think we have to continue to try and understand and resolve into the future. And I don't think there's like a perfect kind of resolution, right, that can be achieved amongst this. And I don't think the desire is to like, I don't think the problem will ever be solved. I don't know. Like, it's just not something that I'm approaching as like, oh, we're going to solve it for good. It's a very case by case thing, where it brings up a lot of interesting questions, where we're finding that both device theater and indie games are like, it's very hard to document on multiple levels.
Yeah.
And hard to reduce to an abstraction. And when you're encountered with that, like, we have strategies to deal with that in device theater, right? Because we're not working from a script. We're working, there's still a situation though, however, if you want to experience the work, or experience a version of the work, you have to essentially experience the full duration of that work, which is not true if you were able to, say, look at a piece of music notation, right? Like, you could be able to glance at a piece of music outside of its time domain. But if you were to experience a game or a device theater thing, you kind of have to like to evaluate it for yourself. You are committing the duration it takes to do the thing, right?
Yeah.
Because it's so experiential and largely because I think it's an embodied thing. And so um, basically it's like a continued questioning of all of that. Like how, how do like just trying to understand um, how are some of the thinkings that we're bringing into games like help us kind of um, continue to think about the problems that we had in performing arts in a different way and vice versa. Um, I I think those are um, from an artistic level and a organizational level something that we learned something of in this game, making it and there are still many questions to try and answer or at least explore. Um, and I think that's kind of the thought of setting up a quote unquote practice for the company itself and what it does. Um, Outside of that, I learned a lot. I should learn a shit ton of things about like, like logistics of like finance, like funding and finance and working with
Oh yeah, of
publishers and like
course.
all of that stuff, right? Like we learned a lot of that stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, the most compelling thing about this medium is where art and performing arts and technology are really merging, but I can also see how that could cause conflict and friction.
Well, I think it's from like a just a purely process level of like all of those things. And this is the case with any discipline, um, or any kind of discipline. Um, they all just have different ways of doing things. And um, you know, when you do cross-disciplinary collaboration, you they do kind of come into collision with each other, and but that collision creates energy,
Mm,
right? And my opinion of it is, at least in the arts, is that if you cross disciplines like that and they collide with each other, each discipline has to be ready to give up something that they value, so as to make enough space to fill that um, what they've given up with something new, right? Because like you can't I well, not that you can't, but it's in my opinion that if you try to just continue to be additive on top of that stuff, you don't make the necessary space, in which something new from that collision can hold, I guess, or be occupy.
yeah,
Um, so, uh, but of course, there's the collision of culture, right? It's not only just of discipline, but it's also of culture and of all that stuff. Um, I'm sure it has not is not um has been an ongoing thing in games for a long time, right?
yeah,
Like, how do you get the programmers to talk to the writers? How do you get the
yeah,
writers to talk to and how do you get the, actors to talk to the writers? How do you get the actors, um, like, is there a benefit to actors even talking to the programmers on the game? Like, who knows? We like in like our case, like that's just a normal thing because it was a relatively small office, right?
sure.
And I don't know if it really, there was any like immediate resulting outcome for that, but, I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling here
No,
on
no,
that
this
sense.
is cool stuff.
um, yeah, but I do think the production of games is the story and narrative of the production of games is maybe the story of these things and these collisions.
Mm,
And maybe that's one way to try and understand what are some fun things to work on next.
yeah. So I guess to get dramatic, if that's okay,
Yeah.
uh, obviously, I think one of the things that has resonated with people most about this game is a lot of, you know, you and the team's personal hardships that you were able to include thematically, stuff about the Asian diaspora, stuff in your lives. And um, I guess the question that I was going to ask about that was, sometimes even I have moments where I'm like, what you were saying, like, how do you keep living? I mean,
Yeah.
even today we're facing bigger problems in the world, in the environment, in things that are too
Yeah.
long to list, and everybody has their own. And so I guess for you, how do you resist in times of hardship?
That's also a really good question. I think um, kind of recognizing, and it's interesting because it kind of also comes back to, I mean, obviously, like the way, at least I'm like so art pilled, that like it always comes back to some degree in which the way I think about art, um, and having to operate as an artist, um, say like prior to getting into games, um, is that, as a art for an artist, I think to largely thrive and make a difference, at least in the arts world, um, in my opinion, again, they all have to die some degree of ego death.
Mm.
um, and that ego death involves them kind of being very honest with themselves about what um, what they're good at, and and what they're good at, in the sense, and that can change, always be shifting and changing, um, but also maybe what they're good uh, at any given moment, or what they are kind of in a situation to maybe intervene on an interesting level, based on their background and their expertise and their experience at that any given time slice, um, and that definitely happened for me in the music world, which is kind of why I shifted towards more kind of strange electronic experimental stage works, because I just felt like I had a real disconnect with this classical contemporary music world,
Mm.
um, largely because multiple trips to Europe was just like, these people live and breathe it, and I really didn't, and I admitted that to myself, like I have no, I don't live and breathe this in a way that they do, and so I don't think I should play the same game that they're playing, because I'm gonna to lose, I guess, or at least I'm not gonna be able to make the most interesting kind of contribution that I could, I think, as a person. And so like I think, I mean, trying to come back to your question here, where it's like, how does one resist,
Yeah.
is like really to kind of perhaps see, uh um kind of be honest with yourself at that any given moment, what is perhaps the most interesting intervention that you can make,
Mm.
within your means and within your feasibility, um, and then to do it, right? Um, and and there's a degree of like huge honesty here, right? With yourself, that you have to have, um, because we all wish we all had all the resources to be able to make the most big affecting intervention, right?
Of course.
But maybe there is, um, more smaller subversive interventions that you can make, that it may not seem immediately obviously useful or big, but um, if but they stack up, right? And then
Yeah.
also, if you're being truly honest with yourself, you're making an intervention that maybe very few people could make for whatever reason, um, and that definitely has, um, generative possibility, right? Anytime you can achieve difference this way, right, by like really drilling down and understanding either difference in yourself, um, yeah. So I don't know if that answers
No, it
that. Yeah,
does. That's
yeah.
so
Or at least in my
meaningful,
opinion on it,
to
right? Yeah,
ask what what can you bring to the world that nobody else can?
yeah, and even on a more like extremely like pragmatic level of that, like, what are the immediate channels in which you could do that,
Yeah.
um, and how not to get caught up in, um, too many things that may, um, distract you from that, because like, we're, in so many ways, the arts community is like a little microcosm of the like community of the left, right?
Yeah, true.
And so there are so many ways in which energy can be spent and sunk into um, logistical apparatuses that may or may not need to exist.
Mm.
And that can take up a lot of people's time. Um, whereas, there's the thought that maybe, like, there are some people who are maybe, like, there are some people, maybe perhaps that's the contribution that they're making, and they're the ones that should make that. And then there are ones in which some people, maybe they should recognize that that's not where they should make the contribution, right?
Mm.
And kind of, push through it, or bypass it in some way. I'm talking at such a theoretical level here in terms of like a very abstract sense, where but I also think like we're at a point in time where we've seen so many of these things fail, again, being very art pilled and like drawing a comparison to the arts,
Mm-hmm.
because it's so interesting how much of that is the similar situation. Like you take something even like the new music world, quote unquote contemporary classical music world, and they have in their kind of like core belief or core canon, so to speak, that they are trying to push new expressions of sound and music
Mm.
and composition. That's why they exist. It's a kind of like modernist replacement for the church that happened in the 20th
Wow.
century, right? And so like that's the project of new music as I understood it. And from people like, especially like somebody as controversial or polemic as Boulez, or other types of kind of hardcore polemic composers. Like, composers love to argue with each other. They love it.
Sure.
And but always the desire to seek out some sort of aesthetic new, which was my understanding of the new music project, right?
Huh?
It was a hugely, by nature, supposedly progressive project. But you actually go and experience that level, and you realize that it's actually the land of institutions, right? And it's the land of institutions which are largely more interested in conservation than of breaking apart
Yeah.
and new expressions. And so like immediately you see this mirrored in so much of the world, and there's a degree in which we're in a position as we are like politically, at least I'm not from the States, but
Sure.
I'm looking inward. But like many of those things that many of the strategies that we've tried, I think there's an acknowledgement that it's like obviously did not work.
Mm-hmm.
And what are some new strategies that will emerge in this way? And maybe those strategies will contain things that will look like something that we previously disagreed with, and
Mm.
or like we previously thought was not useful,
Right.
but to be like perhaps really pragmatic about seizing those things. But I don't know. I'm getting a little political on this podcast now. I don't
No.
know, like on a broad level on what I think about.
Yeah.
But like usually I'm trying to frame about it, like how I see, like, because again, I still see the arts world as a microcosm of like all these different types of things are microcosms of, the larger thing.
Of course.
And I beware always the institution that presents itself as progressive, but
Yeah.
like look at the actions of that and what are the actual mandates of those institutions. And whether, and I'm always back and forth on this because like I am Canadian, so sometimes I don't like to stir up too much conflict.
Sure.
So like,
yeah, you
like
can only, know so
yeah.
much about what people in other countries are experiencing.
Yeah. Yes, and I think and sometimes I actually disagree. My peers don't 100% in the arts see eye to eye with me on this.
Mm.
And whereas I'm always more interested in bypassing those things.
Yeah.
And especially those more conservationist types of institutions. They hold a lot of power and they're very attractive, right?
Sure.
And especially as a young artist, and artists are like, completely susceptible to the kind of cultural capital that institution may give them, because of the power that they hold. But kind of zooming out a little bit, it's like maybe these institutions need to be bypassed, as opposed to, it's this classic thing of like, change from the inside, change from the outside.
Right.
We actually address this a lot with the Noah character in the game,
Mm.
which is like kind of where we put a lot of our thoughts, our conflicting feelings and thoughts about
Mm.
all of this. Yeah, these are just my thoughts. Don't send me hate mail.
No. Well, great questions to be asking for sure. And that about wraps up all the questions I had for you today, Remy. Was there anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think that's great. Um, it was nice to talk about the arts in this way.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
definitely. And I mean, this has definitely been the most theoretical episode I've had of the show, but
I'm
I mean that in a
glad.
cool way.
Okay. I hope it wasn't not too dry for
No,
people.
I hope so.
I think I like slipped into my arts brain a little bit early in this discussion, and
No, but
I
that's
just never
yeah.
got
If
out of
if
it.
that's the real you, that's what people want to hear, I think.
Thank you. Just swirling with thoughts this way, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah.
Then I have to ask, this is the Pixel Pizza podcast. Remy
Mm.
Siu, where is your favorite pizza place?
Oh my God. Okay. I hope this doesn't sound like a strange answer. Um, I recently went on vacation for the first time in 4 years in Japan.
Oh, I was just there last year.
Oh, nice. And like I had not experienced the Japanese obsession with pizza
Hmm.
before, because I think prior visits to Japan I was like zeroed in on like more traditional Japanese food.
Sure.
Um, but there was this one kind of tiny hole in the wall pizza place at Uno Port,
Hmm.
which is a very small town. Um, like largely you take the ferry there to go to Naoshima Island or Tashima
Hmm.
Island, which is kind of where they have a bunch of like contemporary art or whatever flown about. It's like a real estate project, which is always the funny part about these like art places. But anyways, I don't need to get into that here. There is a tiny hole in the wall pizza place there run by like a very young person, a very small staff. And I don't know where he learned to make pizza, but like he's like standing next to the wall, next to this like huge oven, and just like I don't know, it's just making the pizza in front of you and like flash up, like cooks it in like 30 seconds or whatever.
Wow.
And like immediately, because he's like right in front of you, and like immediately drops the pizza in front of you and you have to
Oh,
eat it. Right. And it was like the best pizza I've ever had in my life. And I was like, oh my God, I never had pizza like this before.
oh yeah.
And it was a really simple pizza. Just like I think olive oil, bread, and garlic and tomato sauce, right? So it was like a marinara type
Sure.
of pizza, right? But at home, I like to go to this place called Maple Leaf Pizza, which is like a 90s type kind of cardboard. Like I don't know how you describe this type of pizza. It's not like thin crust pizza, or it's not like it's like what you used to have pizza as a kid
Okay.
if you lived in North America.
Sure.
It's kind of like Pizza Hut, it's kind of like Domino's, but at least old school. Um, and so for some reason, I've like just gravitated completely around this place called Maple Leaf Pizza that makes this kind of 90s
Ooh,
style.
yeah.
Yeah,
Taste of
not fancy. Yeah, tastes a little bit like cardboard. Um, and I love it. I don't know.
definitely the sentimental value, the taking you
Yeah,
back to when you were a kid does so
yeah.
much.
It's thankfully like a very good version of that. Um, like Maple Leaf Pizza. If like you live in Vancouver, you
Mm.
can, I suggest you order Maple Leaf Pizza if you want that kind of nostalgic pizza.
Great. Then thank you once again so much for joining me today. Where can people keep track of you and your work?
You can follow me on Blue Sky at remysiu.com is my handle. And then also you can follow the studio on Blue Sky at sunsetvisitor.studio, which is the handle as well. Yeah, usually that's where we kind of always update, and I always update anything that comes out.
Great. I always forget to mention it, so I will now. Pixel Pizza is also on Blue Sky. That's where I put the episode updates. So yeah, just Pixel Pizza on Blue Sky. You'll find us there too. Uh,
Nice.
so yeah, that about wraps things up. And now we are going to hear one more track from our chiptune artist 380 Bitworks, and that is called Summer's Melancholy. So hope you enjoy that, and we will see you next week with another Pixel Pizza.